Hello, welcome back to a webinar on democracy and its current transformations. My name is Fernando Ayspin. I'm the coordinator of the seminar. And before introducing today's guest, I'd like to make a quick advice. Next Wednesday, our speaker will start his lecture at 7 p.m., not at 6 p.m., because he'll be speaking from Sydney in Australia, and as you can imagine, it will be 5 o'clock in the morning for him. So we thought we should give him a hand and not making him wake up to be ready at 4 o'clock. So remember, next Wednesday at 7 o'clock, John Keane from Sydney University, and today's speaker is Massimo La Torre. He's a professor in legal philosophy from the University of Catanzaro. I think he's much more than a professor in legal philosophy. I think he's quite an intellectual, although his specialty may be the institutional theory of law. He has a book on that in English, Law as an Institution, and another one on constitutionalism and legal theory. He's been working these last years on questions that face directly the problems of democracy, as we are dealing with in these series of seminars. He's also been recently visiting fellow at the University of Tallinn in Estonia. He was also visiting fellow, well, as a matter of fact, he held a chair of excellence at the University Carlos III in Madrid. And well, I will also underline that he got a research award by the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. He's also constantly visiting German universities. So Massimo will present a paper that has the following title: "The Body Unbound: Populism, the Kingdom of Shadows, and the Challenge to Liberal Democracy." Massimo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Fernando. Thank you very much for this invitation. I'm very pleased, honored to be with you, to be able to speak in the framework of the Institución Libre de Enseñanza, an important institution for higher education in Spain, with a great tradition, a great liberal and democratic tradition. I would say the Institución Libre de Enseñanza is really the representative. We will speak of representation later, but it is a good representation, a very good representative of what is the best in the Spanish political tradition. So thank you very much. Now, I will present my paper. My paper is, I've written down my paper. I will read it, but I hope not to be boring and to be able to, let's say, stimulate the attention of the audience. So now I'll start. In a previous paper, I have defined populism as an intractable, unmanageable notion. This is so, I believe, because populism as a notion is often called to cover phenomena that are loosely connected, and also because it is generously used as a polemical label in political fights and parlance. There is a further reason for its intractability, and this is the different levels of discourse where the notion is employed. This, in the literature and academic debates, are basically two. There is a more or less descriptive use of it, but there is also a populism as a political theory, or in a few versions, as a true political philosophy. The two levels, however, are not congruent and do not really have a common referent. What Professors Meny and Gizmeny and Chantal Mouffe, to take two of the most prominent scholars in the field, say about populism is developed at two distant tables of discourse. The one is where the term populism is adopted to understand what is going on in recent politics, especially in the post-1989 political landscape. The other one is rather prescriptive doctrine of how a political program of redistributive justice could once more have a chance to get hegemony over society. The former is a dealing with the is, the latter with the not. Professor Meny is mostly interested in explaining what is happening to liberal democracies once these lose their grip on civil society and the latter is no longer channeled through traditional representative government and its art of keeping separate and independent, distinct political roles and functions. Professor Mouve's attention instead is directed to a possible new mode of doing politics in an age where class conflicts are blurred and seem to become obsolete because of deindustrialization, because of a society increasingly mediatized through images and screens, and because of consumerism. Labor as a source of identity is now replaced by the enjoyment of oneself and one's own pictures and feelings projected as special. Chantal Mouffe tries to envisage and propose a theoretical scheme to make it possible using images and feelings as political arguments. These affections might be instrumental to revive class struggle and give it again a chance to move and offer success to people's subversive aspirations. This way, the people would be assembled not through class functions identity, but rather through an investment of images and iconic ideals elaborated by an impending and decisionist political actor. Such actor should be attempting to become an object of desire and enjoyment for citizens, and thus to offer them an identity through a reflected, aggrandized, and socialized picture of himself. There is indeed little room, very little room, for an overlapping of these two distinct perspectives. We may thus be forced to choose on which of these two tables, so to say, we would like and think it most enriching to play our intellectual or scholarly game and approach populism as a relevant topic of discussion. We might pursue an alt approach, and then a populist normative theory might be of some help to correct several deficiencies of political liberalism and its emotional abstinence. Populism of this sort would support a Republican agenda, giving to it a more robust scheme of existential motivation. We will thus be following Professor Moufe's steps. But we may also assume the other alternative perspective, taking side with Professor Meny, and try to assess whether it might be true what many commentators claim, that we are facing the emergence of a new, not yet clearly understood political phenomenon, that is populism, as a distinct ideal type of approach to power, which can be therefore defined by specific descriptive properties. Now, I believe that it is this second approach, the track, that looks more promising for research and for a contribution to the understanding of our world. This is in particular confirmed by the new unexpected social situation we are now confronted with because of the present pandemic. It is, of course, difficult to assess what the pandemic is and means while we are severely hit by this plague. In a nutshell, we could summarize our present predicament in this way. Confronted as we are with the extreme danger of infection brought about by physical contacts with other people, and with the noli me tangere, do not touch me, categorical imperative, we are radically eschewing such contacts. We do avoid human vicinity. We have been living for several months now, secluded, isolated, locked down. To go on having a more or less usual working day, electronic devices have been massively introduced, and this presently occupy our everyday life. Our isolation is somehow filled in through internet and computers. On the other hand, our body, our material life, has been further abstracted through a radicalized use of online devices and screens, electronic means by which our contact with people and reality is mediated by images and technical representation. But on the other side, our body increasingly gets unbound from this kingdom of shadows, the representative materiality taking place on screens. Through the illness, the pain and sufferance brought about by it. Noli me tangere, do not touch me, seems the ground rule of our life in these months afflicted by the plague, at the same time producing an acute awareness of our existence being rooted in our and others' bodies. We are not touching other people because we are a danger to them, and reciprocally, they might endanger our health. We approach and touch them in a surreptitious way, through online devices, through screens, images, by shadows. However, the illness or its danger puts our body and the feeling of it once again in the center of our existence. The reality of the illness cannot be mediated. We feel bad because our body is hit by the virus. It is not an electronic virus endangering our lives, but unfortunately a real one, a living entity attacking our immunity systems. There is no screen available for this. We are directly exposed to it. The shadow of the image becomes a brute fact, and eventually the brutest possible fact, death. Pandemic thus has a double and ambiguous effect on what we are used to call populism. On the one side, it exacerbates it, since the mediation of our public space is made extreme through the noli me tangere, do not touch me ground rule. But on the other side, since our body gets again a centrality that is basic for our life and survival, mediation and images are much less important. We need care, and this cannot be mediated through screens. Care is not subject to be represented. Care is direct action, and the democracy of care should necessarily refer to a sort of direct, not representative democracy, at least in its core. All the previous arguments, of course, is based on a yet not articulated presupposition that populism is a specific way of performing in the political arena. That is a phenomenon strongly rooted in the kingdom of shadows. Heimat der Schatten, actually a term and an idea firstly coined in Joseph Roth's visionary essay, Der Antichrist. One could try to explain the rooting of populism in such kingdom by deploying ideas and arguments elaborated especially in the work of three authors. Firstly, the already mentioned Joseph Roth, and then Gunther Anders, see his thesis of the phantom and its matrix. Finally, Guy Debord, see his seminal pamphlet, La Société du Spectacle. My basic idea, thus, is that populism is a way of doing politics that is congruent with a society that is mainly taking place in the form of a shadow of iconic representation and visual mediation. It is not theatre. We have here not to do with theatrocracy. This is an expression coined by Plato in his latest work, The Laws, Nomoi, where there he criticizes music and tragedy as perverting the taste of people by giving them a chance of expressing their preferences. Taste is in this way democratized. Ordinary people decide about the merits of a piece of music or a play performed at the theater. The theatrocracy means that the audience decides, not the stage. The rule givers here are ordinary people, consumers of music and tragedy, not the competent musicians and playwrights. In this way, the rule of theater audience reflects and symbolizes the rule of the people in a democracy. And to Plato, this is equally an object for criticism and rejection. Theater is fiction, and the audience, though it is given the power and the competence to evaluate the merits of the piece represented before them, is moved by the stage. The relationship here is somehow only one way down from the top. An audience is enjoying what is done and said on the stage and doesn't have the chance, the power to direct the event taking place on the stage. The destiny of the figures and fictional lives that actors impersonate is outside the scope of intervention from below. Nonetheless, theatre is direct experience. It is direct action. Images in a theatre have a material referent. True, theatre is a represented vicissitude, but not in the sense of mediated through icons. Representation here means presented before an audience. As a matter of fact, actions that are performed in drama are real enough, though they are representative, but they are such without being iconic and being based on screens and its brightness. Theatre is nearly a face-to-face relationship. The fiction is openly exposed and reshaped and offered as a real physical conduct. The stage is a part of a common space where the audience finds its proper place. The drama situation is not thought as an entirely fake experience. The experience of the drama performed by actors is real and lively enough. And this is the reason why it can serve us to rethink our role of actors in real life, to thus find a catharsis, a moment of purification, of a collective emotive reflexivity, whereby we together with others understand what we really are and which are our sins, our guilt as actors in factual life. Quite distinct is the case of what we receive and enjoy by watching a film, a movie, or a TV show, or now more often than not, a computer or a smartphone image. Figures' face projected into the screen are made up, but here the entire action is a making up. Pictures are manipulated, staged, taken and then cut, recolored, and reproduced from a certain angle. Words are pronounced, but then dubbed by a different voice. In such enterprise, we are not ourselves part of the show production in space. We are distant. We do not have eye contact with the actors and the showmen on the screen. We do not really see what they are doing there. But paradoxically, such made-up reality that is transmitted by the show and its image in the screen as experienced by consumers are received with a force of persuasion that can render true what would otherwise be evidently false. What is true becomes a part of what is fake, and is assumed to be a component of this, but will thus be reinterpreted in a way that is no longer falsifiable. The reality projected through icons is a kind of post-truth, nonetheless truer than truth itself. What is here consumed by our eyes before the icons, which we are plunged in, assumes the character of a strict positivity that is not open to contestation. The audience does not really decide here. What matters, the image, the idea, and the message projected is already decided. In the fictional, iconic, digital society, people do not rule. The show and the showman rule them. A movie or a show on a screen is a mode of production taking place entirely in the mode of fiction, of a fake reality in an imaginary dimension. Even when they give us the pictures or the videos of what has really happened, they do lack the sense of a lived experience. The represented reality assumes, in any case, the quality of a show and is no longer responsive to moral judgment. Indeed, this centrality of the show in our perception of what is real is, I believe, the main source of what political scientists now use to call populism. This is in fact politics by a people that is not a real people, indeed by an imaginary one, a fantasized one. The people of populism is a political phantom, and of such phantom, the matrix remains hidden to our eyes and minds, and thus to our possible scrutiny. Now, such phenomenology of political phantom is radicalized by the pandemic situation, while at the same time this pushes it to the extremes of its possible concrete realization and once again unbinds the body politic, cancels its internal mediations and separations, and exacerbates its feelings and dreams of sovereignty. While our physical body is locked down and increasingly bound by this pest and its state of exception, while our private spaces are minimized, that same exceptional state, by giving up the argumentative public space and rewriting this just in terms of a visual experience, by monopolizing and confining publicity into the tiny space of a screen, aggrandizes politics as a phantom with a hidden matrix. Politics is reduced to such a phantom by making of it just the practice of a distant, made-up performance passively enjoyed by spectators, and consequently by cancelling political institutions' internal mediation based on intersubjective conversation and discourse, and basically on our asking for reasons and not just for pictures. But my subject today is a somewhat more general one, that is the challenge and dangers to liberal democracy deriving from populism. Let me thus say a few preliminary things about liberal democracy. This is a political regime especially produced by modernity, meaning by this a society where community for its management is referred to the agreement and certification of citizens as individuals. Modern individuals intend to take back, or else for the first time in history, conquer, control about their lives. And in order to do that, they conceive collective rules and government as directly or indirectly produced by their own decision. In the modern human predicament, law is constrained by citizens' agreement and in addition by a system of separation of powers. Liberalism is an art of separation, first of all between community and individuals, then between government and civil society, finally within the space of the governed between distinct powers and competencies. A democracy is a self-managed rule of law, and a liberal democracy is such self-directed regime with the addition of an internal, somehow disconnected separation of powers. Liberal democracy, thus, in principle, is a somewhat dysfunctional political regime. Decisions are taken by all through representation, and to do this, they need to be elaborated through arguments and discussed and then approved by formal vote or consent. It is a process that needs time and space. It needs mediating bodies, bargaining, sometimes compromise. The general will of democracy is necessarily plural and divided. The law that is the outcome of this self-reflective exercise is then processed by agencies that are distinct in competence and constitution. We have judges, but these need attorneys, advocates to operate, and then they rely on the support of executive bodies. Administrative agencies implement the government's policies, but they also are dependent from special monitoring moments. The democratic state machine does not run by itself, or if it does, it then has a problem. It can easily make collapsing the art of separation that gives it its liberal character. A liberal democracy cannot tolerate and resist too much people. To use an expression by Professor Meny, and the title of his latest book, that is a people that is too big with regard to its members and unaggregatively considered. When the people is referred as a collective, undifferentiated social actor, there is the actual risk that individuals are taken into account only as aggregated molecules of this big, overwhelming entity. And in consequence, the singular specificity and importance might be gone lost. A too much people, as such, can hardly take any direction and decision. It's too heavy to move, since it has, so to say, eaten its own elements. Single persons. They have been digested by its own too fat body without leaving traces of their particular autonomy and will. But a direction should be taken. The fat body should move, and only individuals can do that. The too much people will have then to embrace a special individual that might be considered equally fat. A too much individual, indeed, to show the way and be pushing forward. The too much people requires a soul, a too much leader. Superman shall be then equated with everyman. A people that is too much people is the all imaginary matrix of the phantom leader, appealing to a direct emanation from the people itself and showing its same omnipotency and overarching identity. In such case, there is, alas, no room for opposition or contradiction. This is so because of at least two reasons. First, everything here that is relevant for politics is taking place on a stage that is made up, a fake experience that is not open to be contrasted with the real truth and argumentative discourse. This is due to the new general addiction we are now all victims of. Iconomania, Bildsucht, says Gunther Anders, a deep dependence from images and screens, the show or the iconic spectacle we permanently consume on our multiple screens is opaque to any discursive demand. Il est, to repeat Guy Debord's words, le contraire du dialogue. Second, the phantom is considered to impersonate the entire people, which does not allow for a disaggregation of identities, since here individuals are just considered in terms of organic parts of the big fat body of that too much that is people. To once again quote Guy Debord's words, l'agent du spectacle est mis en scène comme vedette est le contraire de l'individu. The liberal character that projects democracy, the liberal character that protects democracy from its demons to be further potentiated appeals to individuals to act as fragments of a sovereign, as sovereigns in miniature, and in a conflictual concert. And this is done by making them holders of legal rights, sometimes of intense, more or less substantive fundamental rights, and these are developed in judiciable legal titles. By fundamental rights, democracy as an expressive manifestation of will by the people is checked and reaffirmed at the same time in its liberal core, especially when those rights are reassessed and operationalized as principles of a judicial review of legislation. Now, all this liberal democracy's core is well known, and it is part of the legal culture of our constitutional democratic regimes. All this, as it has been just presented, is, of course, a normative scheme, and as such consigned to a high degree of ideality. Reality can contradict such an ambitious ideal dimension, and we have real liberal democracies that do not fulfill their promises of rule of law and human rights. An unresolved problem in such regimes is the permanent tension between the reasons of the public, common good, and the reasons of private property and the free market. A terrible right. Il diritto terribile. This is the qualification Cesare Beccaria, the famous Italian enlightened political thinker, used to give to private property. There is indeed a permanent gap between its claims and the claim of a common good that is irremediably projected into plans of redistribution of common resources. Not to speak of the somehow anti-democratic content of dominion, of absolute control and enjoyment and possible disruption, jus utendi ac abutendi, right of use and abuse that property claims to offer to its holders. On the other side, a free market operates moved by profit, by what is more profitable in terms of egocentric preferences of riches and private enjoyment, and through the spring of competition, that is the struggle to overcome the other in terms of capacity of occupying, winning sectors of the market. In a free market competition, this was once forcibly underlined by George Orwell, reviewing a book by Friedrich von Hayek. In a free market competition, unfortunately, there are losers and winners are deemed to be somehow morally superior. If you are a loser, it might mean that you are not good enough. More than 1 century ago, Max Weber rightly identified the connection between Puritanism and capitalism. Competitions may indeed sometimes be based on the equality of opportunities. In any case, they are not constructed and conducted following the principle of an equal concern. What is mine concerns me here much more than the rest of entitled crimes of others. Right or wrong? Not my country, my business. We shouldn't therefore forget the basic tension between democracy and indeed liberal democracy on the one hand and capitalism on the other. We cannot and should not be so much blue-eyed to ignore such deficiencies and problems and tensions originating from a permanent inadequacy between democracy and rule of law on the one hand and capitalism on the other. There was perhaps a time when one could believe that liberal democracy was a regime coherent with capitalism. But the recent emergence of illiberal, anti-democratic capitalism, paradigmatically the Chinese model, not to speak of Russian oligarchy, does not allow for such an optimistic assumption. We should sadly conclude that there is no necessary connection between liberal democracy and capitalism. This is, I believe, a proven fact. Now, such a fact makes populism and its presence in our society especially dangerous. Capitalism could be re-emerging after a long period of having been put under stress and under more or less public state control after the Second World War for at least 3 decades. It could re-emerge after the Trente Glorieuses because of a specific internal development of the Western liberal society and because of the evident and somehow dramatic failure of the so-called real socialism in Eastern Europe. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 certified that bankruptcy in a definitive way. Such failure was immediately interpreted as giving new force to capitalism and to a form of liberalism based not so much on rule of law and democracy, as rather on private property and free market, private enterprise-led economies. The clocks of history, then, were somehow put back to the time of Manchesterian capitalism. The time, however, the state was meant not just to act as a night watchman, to use Adam Smith's well-known words, but as a proactive agency in the protection and promotion of a free market. So this time, we are back to Manchesterian capitalism, only ideologically indeed. And at least as far as the poorest part of society is concerned. But this time, the state was meant not just to act as a night watchman, but as a proactive agency in the protection and promotion of the free market. This was the agenda of a new kind of political economy and ideology, a new kind of political economy and ideology. And this is neoliberalism, a free market doctrine where property and competition are designed to take place under the umbrella of state management and supervision. This appeal to the state as a regulator of free markets, by the way, is one of the reasons for the success of such new ideology, since neoliberalism could easily be coupled with managerialism and the bureaucratic spirit of our age. there are two main versions of neoliberalism. One is based on law as monitoring the competitive structure of the market, and that is the European continental, mostly German, ordo liberalism. And then there is a somehow more radical and more political version. This is the Anglo-American one, which reshapes the state as a decisionist agency contingently, occasionally, I would even say occasionalistically, attending the needs of the market in its restructuring and deregulating strategies. Law is in this second version is much less useful and essential as device to deploy. What is needed is politics, governmental, direct and punctual measures, political occasionalism. In both versions of neoliberalism, however, the market should be assisted by state intervention that is seen as somehow preemptive with regard to democracy. Preemptive with regard to democracy. In European continental model, this is done by referring political economy to administrative bodies that are now detached from the seat of democratic deliberation, parliaments generally, and operating under some sort of rule of law. A treaty, and a treaty of international law sometimes. In the American version, it is politics that is disconnected from citizenship and its deliberation in the form of a special form of political activism and leadership. Political leadership here is reshaped in terms of a strong charismatic power, and this is in this way able to circumvent any parliamentary perplexity and opposition. Now, populism, I would claim, is the political form and the political phenomenon that is subservient to the second sort of neoliberal hegemony just mentioned. Such hegemonic strategy operates through a strong leadership assisted by personal charisma, and it is made possible by the transformations of our societies where traditional public medias and discourse have been vampirized, first by television and now by digital machines and gadgets. Populism is the political regime and the political movement that is congruent with La Société du Spectacle, intelligently thematized by Guy Debord and anticipated by the so-called Kingdom of Shadows, Heimat der Schatten, depicted by Joseph Roth, and closely identified through the matrix phantom discussed by Gunther Anders. Populism is theatrocracy ruled by one great imagined actor. In the show society, in the kingdom of shadows and screens, there is above all no contact to physical real truth. Fiction is everywhere. What we watch is fake, made up, constructed and designed to just fill our eyes with images that could let us believe to be enjoying something special and fully ours. The image we are seeing in the screens becomes our own live reality that is in this way assumes the character of a show too. We can identify ourselves with it without need of a special justification and without giving it an explicit assent. We thus desperately want to be like that image. We reshape our preferences and lifestyle to be as similar to that picture as possible. We even try to remodel our bodies accordingly. The phantom there, the showman, the big man or big woman, our leader then is us. Indeed, he or eventually she is not just a representation of us. It's just what we, by desire, want to be and actually become. It might even be that we are before an anthropological mutation. From the human being as animal rationale, as it has been thought of by the classical philosophical tradition, we may now be mutating into a new, different kind of living being, the Homo videns, to accept a suggestion by Giovanni Sartori, a distinguished Italian political scientist. Homo videns is a human being that approaches the world and seeks to get information about it just by visual passive practice without elaborating its sense data, the pictures enjoyed, in an act of understanding and operating by interpretation. Reasoning and understanding, in this case, are fully absorbed by watching. Biopolitics, a politics that invests our bodies and transforms them, is driven by such anthropological mutation, for it is fed by the many pictures that fill our imagination in the kingdom of shadows we are now subjects of. We fictionally transform society by artificially readjusting our physical image and being. The making up that is the action on the screen, the fashionable VIP we are watching in a reality show, doing nothing and telling trivialities, are internalized and rewritten in our bodies. Tattooing is just one, now quite widespread way of making of our bodies sorts of screens and icons. Once we are not given the chance to change the world, what we do is to change the haircut, to get a new body by plastic surgery, or to get color pictures on our skins by way of tattooing or pissing. A politics is produced in the screens by icons. This is capable by simplification and appeal to our feelings and affections to be synthesized in an image with an absolute legitimacy. An absolute legitimacy, the legitimacy of being a very important person, because in the eyes of everyone, no arguments, no substantive virtues are needed for such legitimacy and its messages and injunctions, nor could one claim any rights against such image, since the phantom pretends to be the embodiment of all our possible goods and thus rights. Rights are projected as objects of enjoyment in the shadow of the screen. This is now the real matrix of what we are, and such a picture projected is the source of our dignity. Populism is radically fed by the present phenomenology of our visual experience. What are now the dangers of populism for liberal democracy? I believe we can identify at least 5 problems or issues that liberal democracy is traditionally confronted to deal with and solve. There is first the question of identity to solve. Liberal democracy tends to be based on a thin common identity of its citizens. Here, patriotism is mostly referred to the loyalty to the law and the Constitution. Further allegiances and memberships do not seem to be especially relevant. But we may ask, can a people, the class of citizens that are called to abide by the law and mutually acknowledge each other a stake in this game, can they get a common identity just through the assumption of the rule of law and the Constitution? Why is the rule just for them? One could reply, because they have agreed so. But why they, that particular class of people, gather and recognize each other a common stake, such as to require to enter into a common scheme of law? It would seem that the people is a class, a group that is necessarily pre-existent to the social compact, giving rise to the Constitution, and whose identity, therefore, is to be found outside that Constitution. Then there is the question of power. The art of separation that is liberalism, by introducing too many mediating and monitoring agencies and by multiplying the levels of competencies, seem to relegate the single citizen in a too empty and powerless space. Peter Mayer, an Irish political scientist, believed that empty politics is a collateral damage of people that are not given centrality in the political agenda. Colin Crouch, a British scholar, speaks of post-democracy. This is very much related to the following question. An additional serious problem is the issue of redistribution of resources. Could this be left to the solitary game of stock exchange operators and free markets? Such game has been intensified and practically made boundless by globalization. Markets globalize, escape state control. In such situation, the citizen will have once more an accrued sense of his or her own impotence. Lack of grip. The national public sphere, the traditional arena of politics, seems to have lost all its relevance. Markets operate as globalists, cosmopolitans, not as members of a national community. And then they have, as it was already shown by Karl Polanyi, a proclivity to commit suicide and to force upon society. See what has happened in our world after the 2000 financial crisis. The cost of rescuing them, mostly banks, has proven once and again. But citizens also need myths and images, examples to follow, icons to use as models of their conduct. Is a gray liberal democracy, operating just by law and separation, and the thin overlapping consensus, to use John Rawls' notion for political liberalism. Is a neutralist state without strong lessons and a good life program be able to feel the need for sense, for the sense, to feel the need for sense of the citizen? Finally, which kind of character does liberal democracy produce? Is there in such regime a sufficient attention to the formation, the Bildung, of good citizens, of people with specific traits of character and appropriate virtues? Could liberal democracy survive without producing individuals endowed with virtues that are required for the felicitous running of such a regime? Don't we have here a need of virtuous persons? Could a society in general survive without being able to mobilize virtues that support it? Could citizens peacefully live together without acknowledging each other some virtue? Civic republicanism needs republicans. Now, in a sense, these 5 problems are the outcome of the very essence of liberal democracy, of its epistemic and moral abstinence with regard to citizens' good life. Liberal democracy leaves the care of such essential human dimension to individual decisions and deliberations, and rightly so, we could add. Otherwise, it would make the people a too much entity where person will count for very little. But is this done wisely? Populism seems to solve all the 5 questions here listed. The identity is offered by the body of the leader and the phantom evocation of an imaginary thick people. By this phantom, the citizens is given back a fictitious idea of holding immediate, direct power insofar as he or she has a non-mediated identification and emotional and visual convergence with the person of the leader and the collective phantom that is looming behind such brilliant, big figure. Distribution of resources is guaranteed by the riches that the leader and his phantom are able to evocate and let believe that they dispose with. Sense is offered by the permanent representation of a common show and the attached icons and conduct models. Indeed, plenty of sense seems to be offered by the affluence of exemplary pictures projected. And the character is the one that is preached and exemplified by the leadership and its phantom, its imaginary virtues. In this way, populism fills all the gaps left open by illiberal democracy. The inevitable turbulence connected with these issues is replaced by the turbulence and the outcry of that acclamation required by the projected phantom. In conclusion, the danger that populism represents for liberal democracy is the realization of its unfulfilled promises by making it entirely collapse into a fictional, compact people's rule. While liberal democracy risks to offer not much more than politics without people. Politics without people. Populists' efforts tend to implement a people without politics. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Massimo. And now we'll pass over to the questions until we get more questions. We have already some. I would like to put one question myself, because you haven't talked that much about specifically political representation, and I think in the end all your paper somehow is talking about a certain failure of representing people, right? Which is a failure within liberal democracy, and it also seems to be a failure in case of populist, in its populist versions. But don't you think that, are you holding a thesis that's close to the one by Pierre Vaillant, that we have, instead of developing a representation of interests, which was more or less the liberal paradigm, we're moving over to a representation by identification with a leader, right? So we need to be represented in the sense that we identify with a leader in order to become one. Somehow I think you referred to that indirectly when you were talking about populism, and this reminds me of of course of Thomas Hobbes' title page of Leviathan, right? So where you know, the populist leader is the head, and then his body is the people. You remember what Chavez used to say, soy pueblo, huh? I'm people. So that's what my body is made of, right? My body is made of people. So, well, I'd like to see what you have to say about it, because I think if this is the case, and I think Rosan Vaillant thinks this is the case, then we find that these kind of schemes of representation by identification can only be attributed to leaders of ordinary liberal democratic parties, so to say, non-populist party. Is Macron a leader of politics by, or representation by identification? As you know, there's this new subject regarding if there's the possibility of having centrist populism, right? And of course, Macron would be the obvious example. I leave it there because we have some questions already. Go ahead if you want to start answering, so that.
Yes, I think. Thank you very much for your questions. I think you identified. The real difference we are now facing the changing, the mutation of the notion of representation. I would say, this is very interesting. This would be, we are in a sense back to a pre-modern concept of representation, but in a completely different, so a pre-modern concept in a postmodern context. The postmodern context is the Société du spectacle, is this Heimat der Schatten, the kingdom of shadows, where everything is projected on a screen. Reality is only the reality you can enjoy on a screen. Okay, this is clearly postmodern. This is completely new. Even we have a new anthropology, the Homo videns identified by Giovanni Sartori. But by this postmodern development, paradoxically, we are, so to say, project back to a pre-modern notion of representation. You, in a sense, already mentioned this. So the pre-modern concept of representation, especially with kings, okay, the idea of king. There is an interesting book by Marshall Salins and David Graeber about that. So the king we find this also somehow in Hobbes too, as you say, in the page, in the cover page. The king is meant to represent its own people, to represent in the sense that is, in a sense, the mirroring of its own people, organic mirroring of its own people, embodying its own people, and by identification. So there is an organic identification. There is I like very much Thomas Mann. I like Thomas Mann, and I try to read Thomas, although I never succeeded in reading Joseph und seine Brüder. Joseph and his brothers has been a bit too much to me, but I will try hard. But I have read a lot. I've read nearly all his other novels. Now, there is one of the first novels is Königliche Hoheit. Royal Highness. I don't know in English.
Majesty.
Royal Majesty, exactly. Now, this is, looks like a kind of ironic book, and a pleasant story, not very heavy story, and so on and so on. But it is the book that was meant, it is a book published before the First World War. And there was there, that they were quarreling, the two brothers, Heinrich, so the eldest brother, Heinrich Mann, also very famous novelist, very good. But a democratic one, a liberal democrat, strongly democratic one. And Thomas was extremely conservative, extremely nationalist. He has a terrible book, Betrachtungen eines Unpolitischen, consideration of an unpolitical, a thick book published in 1918. Okay, now the two brothers, there was a family quarrel, but there was a political quarrel, huge, big, important political quarrel. And they didn't speak each other for years, actually. And now, this quarrel was, so to say, made explicit through two novels. There is one novel by Heinrich Mann, Die kleine Stadt, I think it is 99 or something like that. And this is a novel about theatrocracy. So it's a representation, very interesting, of democracy as a theater. Because I cannot tell you the story, but democracy is represented as turbulent audience at the opera house. So it's an opera house, and this is a kind of metaphor of democracy, and it's very sympathetically presented. The reaction, so it's a strong, so in a sense, representative democracy with strong element of direct democracy too. So people participate. So I believe that the representative democracy needs elements of direct democracy or participation. Otherwise, And this is the problem, I would say, for liberal democracy in our time. The reply was Thomas Mann's novel, Königliche Hoheit, and there you find a different notion of representation. And you know what because it's a story of one of the small kingdoms still existing in Germany, you know, before the unity of 1771. And even later, there were still small kingdoms. Okay, and the representation. This is explicitly said in a page. Now I don't have the book with me, and you know the representation is, according to Thomas Mann, that the king, the prince, the young king, had the same face, the same physical traits as his subjects. So why? What was the representation? This is terrible because there is a kind of ethnical, racist implication too. You understand? But for what we are concerned with now in our discussion, the representation is that the king, the leader, is mirroring the traits, the characters, the feature of its people. This is so exactly what you said. This is exactly what Rosa Van Loon is underlying. We are going from representation of interest now to representation of for representation through identification, through identity, which is a pre-modern kind of representation, absolutely pre-modern, but in a completely different context as the pre-modern one.
Okay, Massimo, we have here some other questions here. Francisco Javier Anzuategui. He says, I have two questions. First, in public discourse, we find references to right-wing populism and left-wing populism. Based on the characterization that you have offered in your lecture, does that distinction make sense? This would be the first question. Are there differences between these two populism? Second, the relationship between populism and the society of the spectacle is correct, I think, but given the hardly reversible character of this model of society, in what sense should society be transformed to avoid the growth of populism? So, right wing, left wing, is there a difference? And secondly, can we get rid of this society of the spectacle?
Well, you know, populism. I mentioned that I wrote a paper before about populism that's been published in a book on populism. I was and I still am a bit skeptical about the too generous use of populism, because populism has been used, is still used by for political reasons, in a sense, for political. In a sense, to depict a specific movement as a negative one. So it's not now used mostly as a, let's say, descriptive label, the descriptive notion, but it's used really in a very pragmatic and instrumentalist way. So I don't know, you know, so many different things have been and are now labeled as populists. So I think left-wing populism, right-wing populism, it's difficult to. We should then look in detail what is meant by this, how it is used, by whom it is used, and so on and so on. Unfortunately, this is the situation. This is an additional question, additional problem for the use of the term, because the term is too generously and too loosely used. But of course, once if we speak of this identification, this representation by identification, representation by icons, this I think could happen both on the right and on the left. I think it is. I would say that I think in Europe we have this mostly on the right. But okay, I'm open to analyze the single case. And the other question, what could we do to reduce this, to solve this situation? I think that we could do. There is one thing we should do. I think the thing we should do is, and that we should think of liberal democracy in a different way. So I think we should restart using a liberal democracy in a not so, let's say, minimal way as it was done. It has been done in the last 30 years. So I think we should have a liberal democracy that where politics makes sense. It's not, populism is fed by the fact that politics participation does not make too much sense. If parties have the same program, for instance, they are so much different in terms of what they want for the redistribution of resources in a society. If parties are the same, or more or less the same, as far as, for instance, labor law is concerned, so the notion of how people should spend their life in the working place, if there is no difference for right and left, or on this, and I have the impression there isn't very much, then I think politics has a good chance to be there, because then could identify this as the establishment, could be mobilizing frustrations, and so on and so on. And so this is one point. And the other point is we cannot, democracy cannot believe that opinion is consigned to the market. So a market now means, be aware, market means today screens. The market is the screen. What the market is taking place on a screen. So we cannot believe really that the opinion, public opinion, for instance, the so-called fourth power, press, so to say, but public opinion, journalism or information is done by market, because this is suicide. Because the opinions will be money, that will be, everything will be fake, because they were used for power and for profits. So I think we should reestablish, I don't know how, for instance, to give a major role to public televisions, for instance, or to major role to other types of publicly shared space where you can offer information. But if you don't identify the problem is the so-called fourth power is completely vampirized today by the market and by the public opinion. People are educated, citizens are formed. Now, citizens for a liberal democracy should be formed by the liberal democracy itself, not by the market.
Yeah, we have here some other questions. They're not easy to answer, because I take this one by Carmen Hormigo. Don't you think that the rise of populism in part comes from the fact that, politically speaking, we citizens have become functionally illiterate? So she seems to point to to citizens themselves. I think this connects with something that I found quite interesting, which is that a liberal democracy without a republican spirit will never work. So you said something like that, right? So we have to focus on that dimension of the les citoyens. Huh? I think we have a problem with citizens. Would you like to comment something on this, or should I?
I think we should, Fernando, we should find, I think, a liberal democracy should offer the citizens, the people, places where meeting freely and discuss. I don't know, or to develop a culture of discussion. You know, in my generation, the culture of discussion was politics, because we were still, let's say, under the 68 wave, big wave. And in schools, we discuss, with 15, 16, we discuss about Marx, we discuss about liberalism, we discuss in classroom, at home, when we were meeting, there were parties, there were groups, there were everything, theater and cinema, the Cine Club. You remember? I don't know, perhaps you also have this wonderful experience of the Cine Club. We went to Cine Clubs. I went to the cinema when I was 18, practically every night, because I was the member of 3 or 4 different Cine Clubs. So every night there was an incredible, strange film. I don't know, the Mood Now, the German Expressionists, and so on and so on. And then there was an introduction before the movie, and after the movie, discussion. And then we were children, we were kids, but we were discussing German Expressionism. That was enough. And seriously, more or less, well, as far as serious as possible, because we didn't know anything actually about that. But now, the society was full of these moments of conversation. Now we don't have moments of conversation, except for the screen again, Facebook, Twitter, and then we are lost. We are lost because there is no real conversation there.
Yeah, I would agree on that. I would certainly agree on that. We have here also questions on what kind of representation would be best, because it seems that representation of let's say of small communities, of regions, of the nation, seems to be a break for an operative democracy. But on the other hand, representation by political parties doesn't work either. So, what do you think about it? What way should we try?
I think we can try to, this is a very interesting question. We could make a conference about
sure.
The notion of political party. The notion of political party is very interesting, and we in the 20th century we experienced a strong change of the notion of what is a political party. But every party that I know is a Leninist party. So the model of a political party in the 20th century was Lenin party. Everyone speaks of militants today, even the Partido Popular. I'm surprised. So the Partido Popular in Spain is a Leninist party, and the Socialist Party is also a Leninist party. So the structure of the party, the idea of the party is the Leninist party. Now, the Leninist party might have been successful, I don't know, in a specific moment of there was a civil war, but it's not the party that encourages really participation. And I think we should, but and this is a party that encourages very much the control of the top on the elite, over the so-called militants. I think there hasn't been in any party that I know really. Something perhaps in the German social democracy sometimes, but very little actually, a real thematization of this problem. There isn't. So we of course now parties do not really are very nearly irrelevant in now they are phantoms, so to say, but they still operate according to the Leninist blueprint, I would say, and this doesn't. We should try another road.
Yeah. Okay. We have. I think this would be the last, because we're running out of time. The last question: how can we fight against populism?
Well, it's a big question.
Also, we can organize also another
I think
conference.
we should fight against populism with being sensible. I think we should. The way to fight about populism is to, on the one, the question is, the risk is that in order to fight with populism, you say that Ursula von der Leyen is our the best possible world. You understand? And this would be the great mistake. Or in order to find populism, we say Macron is wonderful. And I think this was also what more or less Jürgen Habermas said. Jürgen Habermas supported very much Macron as a hope for Europe and so on and so on. Now, this is what we should avoid. We should try to remain critical about what is going on about the liberal democracy as it is. In order to fight populism, we should be in a sensible way, in a rational way, in a conversational way, in an open way, but we should remain, I think, critical about recent developments of our liberal democracies, because populism is somehow a reaction, is reactive, at least for many, many people, before the developments that have been, I think, somehow present now for these 30 years. So I think the danger is we fight against populism, and we are, I'm joking, so to say, yeah? But then Macron is our hero. Macron is not our hero, cannot be our hero.
Okay, so the last one. I think Javier, who's collaborating with us here, would you like to make it directly?
Hello. Yes, there's a last question posed by Anna Winter. Well, she briefly asked Massimo to specify his concept of liberal democracy. If you could develop a little bit the concept of liberal democracy that you were that you had in your intervention.
Well, it's a big question, actually. My concept of liberal democracy is the ideal of the liberal democracy. So it's a democracy where you have representation, so you have a parliament that is really representative of the interests of the citizens. And then so you have a general will, and this general will has also some based in the general participation of citizens. So you have political parties. Political parties are seats for participation. You have unions. You have civic organizations. So all this is very important. And then, of course, you should have also monitoring bodies. So I think you should have courts. You should have a judicial review. And you should have a real separation of powers. So this is my notion of liberal democracy. You can ask where and when did we have such a liberal democracy in its ideal form? I could easily reply never. But we had moments in history where we were closer, and now we are, I think, less closer than in other moments.
Okay, thank you very much, Massimo, and thanks very much for all of you who have joined. We'll be back on Wednesday. Don't forget, it will be at 7 o'clock p.m. Central European time. And then we'll welcome John Keane from the University of Sydney. Thanks again, Massimo. Piacere, grazie. Ciao.